when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello, welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is a former Air Force and recently retired airline pilot, and she is the author of the book From Plane to Plane, My Mennonite Childhood, A National Scandal, and an Unconventional Sword of Freedom, which will be available on February 23rd. You can find her on her author page on Facebook, which I will link in the description. Patty Bear, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited to talk to you, and I find your story so fascinating. Can you give us a synopsis of the book?
Sure. So it's a memoir, and it takes place over the course of 10 years from the time I was 8 to 18. And so I was born into this 400-year-old sect among the plain people of Pennsylvania, which is the Amish and the Old Order Mennonites. And so in these kind of cultures, women are raised to be silent, submissive, obedient, and basically to know a woman's place in a man's world. And that's the only world I knew. It's a one that I wanted to become a part of more than anything. And but when I was 8 years old, my father got excommunicated and shunned. And this set off about a decade-long saga of court cases and national publicity and then hidden violence. And I had grown up on this farm, this large potato farm. And we ended up, my mother and the 6 of us children ended up fleeing and kind of living on the run for about 10 years. And, but out of this whole upheaval, what happened is everything that I had been taught, I began to question. I began to question the background. Part of that is we couldn't vote. Weren't allowed to have television or watch movies or makeup or anything worldly. You couldn't press charges. So if someone robbed your house, you couldn't really do anything about it. Couldn't join the military. Not women, certainly not women, but not men either. And you couldn't have become a pilot because it was part of the worldly world. And it was considered that you would become corrupted. That was the fear. But out of all of these things that happened, it sort of catapulted me out of that world, and I began to experience new things and question the things that I had been taught. And that led to an entirely different life as a military pilot eventually, and an airline pilot.
So you were introduced to aviation when you were a teenager, is that right?
That's correct. So my older brother was always a very forward-thinking person, and he was one of these people who, when he was doing something, he always thought somebody else should be doing it. And so, and I had a job from the time I was in 5th grade. And we all had jobs, so we had our own money. And my brother is like, "Oh, you should come take flying lessons," because he was taking them. And I was like, "I don't want to take flying lessons. I barely have any money as it is," and it wasn't really something that interested me. But he was very persuasive, and I was like, "Okay, I'll go." And I took the first lesson, and it wasn't like I loved it. You know, I didn't even have my driver's license yet, so I was kind of scared. I was afraid I might crash, and I got airsick. And but I just kind of kept taking them. I decided I would go to solo, which was like 10 hours, and then I would quit and spend my money on something more useful. But I didn't. I ended up getting my private pilot's license just as I graduated from high school.
And then when you graduated, you went to the Air Force Academy?
Yeah. So, and that was part of leaving this other world. I had determined that because of the circumstances that I grew up in with the violence, I watched my mother's life, and I was like, I do not want that life. Like, I want to be financially independent. And, but I had no idea how I was going to do that. And higher education in these cultures is discouraged as well, because you might get educated away from the truth, is the way they describe it. And my father was adamantly, he had trained us from a very early age that we shouldn't go to college. But again, my older brother, he heard me talking about how I wanted to make my own money, and I thought that I needed to go to college to do that. And so he said to me, he said, well, he said, you need to take 4 years of math and science and 3 years of a language, and you should take the hardest classes you can take, the AP classes and honors classes. And so I was like, okay, he must know what he's talking about. And so I just followed his instructions to the T, um, and I got recruited. I won this race. I talk about it in the book in sort of a funny way. I ran this race in 8th grade and got recruited into uh, cross country, varsity cross country, and which that was different for our background too, participating in sports or clubs or anything like that. So I don't have any way of paying for college. I'm like, well, maybe I'll get a scholarship, a running scholarship. And at some point, I realized I wasn't good enough to get a scholarship to pay for college, and I had no idea how I was going to do this. And then this cadet comes to our school, and there was an announcement that a cadet from the Air Force Academy was going to talk in the guidance counselor's office, and I didn't even know what that was. Like, from our background, I was like, well, that sounds like it might have something to do with flying. And so I went in. I was like, well, I didn't have anything better to do in study hall the next period. And it just completely changed the trajectory of my life.
So this brother of yours, what was the age difference? How many siblings did you have?
So there's 6 children. I had 2 older brothers. He was my oldest brother, and 3 younger sisters. And most of us are about a year or a year and a half apart. So he was 3 years older than me.
It sounds like he provided you with a lot of leadership and guidance.
He really did. He was a mentor, and he kind of liked that. He would tutor us in classes that we found difficult. So yeah, it made a huge difference, and I dedicated the book to him.
Oh, that's great. That's
Yeah.
really cool. I have a question. So I listened to your interview, and for everybody else who wants to go way deeper with Patty about her story, her life story, and kind of the things that she's doing now, she did a great interview with the Onward podcast with Emily Harmon, and I'll put a link in the description to that. I really enjoyed getting to know you through that interview. But I don't think that you covered this. I'm interested to know how you were on sort of the first wave, or this, well, you were still the first wave of women to go to a military academy. You weren't the first year, but the first wave. And I'm really interested to know how that culture compared. I mean, did you see any parallels in the male-dominated culture of a military academy, of aviation, military aviation, to your childhood?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually talk about that a little bit in the book, at the end. And I got to the Air Force Academy just as the third class that included women, was graduating. So it was still pretty young, pretty early in the cycle. So yes, but so coming from that background, I go to the academy, and I worked so hard to get into the academy. Like I talked about nothing else for a year and a half, and my brothers and sisters were all just kind of tired of it. They would like roll their eyes like, oh God, can't she talk about anything else? So I was so over the moon when I got in, and I couldn't afford to go out and visit. So I'd never been there. And I go out, and I kind of, my mother wore these long dark dresses and a black bonnet and a white cap, and everywhere we went, she stood out. I know one time when we went to school, some little kid yelled, "Look, there's a pilgrim." So, and this was from having been in the national news. This was a very searing experience. So naively, I thought when I went to the academy that I wouldn't stand out at all. Like I was going to be anonymous, right? So you look at it now, you're like, well, you're only 10%. Of course, you're going to stand out. But I didn't it never occurred to me. So it was a huge culture shock when I got out there to face the hostility. And so yeah, there were a lot of parallels. There was that, that you didn't belong there, that I remember some guy telling me that, we women were just there to get a husband. And I was like, well, what? They're just such easier ways to get a husband, yeah, there were a lot of parallels. And, you're just kind of confronting that entrenched mentality.
Yeah. Well, thank you for breaking the way for the rest of us. We appreciate it. We're still working on things.
we we are indeed. It's kind of amazing to me, 40 years later that we've made progress, but it's been glacial in my estimation.
Absolutely. I agree. So you decided to write a book. When did you come to that decision, and what were you trying to accomplish by writing this?
So I had decided that I wanted to write this book a long time ago, and I really don't. It was decades ago, but it was just a question of when the timing was right. And what did I want to accomplish with it? There were two main things. One, I wanted to. It was an accountability project. So, readers will see in the book there was this national story that was very searing, where my mother and even us children were vilified in the national press, and it felt very unjust. And so I always wanted to set the record straight. A is just as a matter of justice, and B, for the next generation. And I think that's something that's important to do. The second reason was I wanted to show this path that it's kind of a path of magic and mystery, but it doesn't always look sparkly, and it's this idea that sometimes trauma can be a liberating path. Because one of the things I was always aware of is that without what happened as a child, and without the severity of it and the length of it, I would have joined. I would have had my mother's life. I've always known that. And not only would I have had her life, but I would have, my desire to follow the rules, or to excel, to achieve. I would have been one of those women that are enforcers of these kind of cultures, the Aunt Lydias or the Serena Joys in The Handmaid's Tale. And it's not something I'm proud of, but it's like, that's what I would have been, So that was the other part of it, to show how this path, how sometimes the things that happen in life lead us out and toward freedom, even though they're not that much fun to go through.
Wow. I didn't grow up anything close to the culture that you grew up in. Is there anything from that experience, and I hope maybe you talk about it in the book, but like looking back, are there any redeeming qualities from that culture? Because from the outside looking in, it just looks like complete oppression. Do you look back and with any light on, the culture, or how do you feel about it?
So this is a culture, it's interesting that that's your perspective, because so many people idealize this culture, and because it has a very bucolic look. And I write about that in the first pages. It is some parts of it are a very bucolic existence. There's very much a rhythm. You're very grounded to the land, nature, farming, that sort of thing, in the seasons. And so I think that, is there anything redeeming about it? I think that it's like, it's kind of like a math problem. Is that on the whole, is it redeeming? And for me, to oppress half the population, that doesn't add up. And you can have these other things. You can have the bucolic aspects. You can have the simplicity without that. Um, so that's kind of where I come out with that.
Wow. Do you maintain any connections to that community at all?
Yeah, that community is interesting. So if you join it and you choose to leave or you get kicked out, you get excommunicated and shunned, which is what happened to my father. My mother eventually left, and so the same thing happened to her, although it bothered her a lot less than it bothered him. And so I have all of my relatives are in that community, which is what makes the shunning part of it so difficult for people. But and that didn't happen to us because we didn't officially join. It didn't happen to us children. So you maintain these contacts with your relatives, but it's like they live in one world and you live in another, if that makes sense. So
I mean, it makes
so
sense just from like leaving your childhood community for those people who stayed and never move out or experience anything different. So I would think that a culture like this that's so insular, it would be even more pronounced.
it is more pronounced. That's a good way of putting it. And no hard feelings, but you just kind of live in two different worlds, and so lose contact.
You recently retired from the airlines. We didn't talk about that part of your career. Tell us a little bit about that transition from the Air Force, the airlines, and your transition to retirement.
So the transition from the Air Force to the airlines, I got out just after the first Gulf War, and so the airlines were starting to hire, and then they shut down. So nobody was hiring for about a year. So that was the period I was like, oh my gosh, am I ever going to get hired? Which I think everybody does. Every pilot who's pursuing, the airlines feels that way. And then I got hired, and I had a long career there, and 28 years. And then when COVID came up, there was opportunity to take an early out. And I did what I've always done in my life, which is I just kind of pay attention at this intuitive level. And it was like, it just felt like the right time to leave. So it's been a little bit of an adjustment because I loved being a 777 captain. I liked being a leader. I liked, physically flying, but it just felt like it was time. And so,
And did you have the book already written before you retired, and you were planning to put it out already?
yeah. So I finished the book. I finished my part of writing it last spring, and then I had it professionally edited and had my mom check over, make sure the facts were correct and things like that. And yeah, so it was going through this process and was going to be coming out anyway. Yeah.
And it comes out on February 23rd, is that right?
It does indeed.
Very excited about that. Would you mind sharing a passage with us so that we can get a feel for the book?
Sure. I'd never wanted to leave that bucolic life of bare feet on a country dirt road, the chorus of birds in the meadow, or swinging on a rope above the creek and jumping off at the highest moment in exaltation. I'd never dreamed of being anywhere but there. I certainly never imagined being here in this place for this job. And yet sometimes I still shudder thinking how narrowly I escaped that life. What might have been if it hadn't been for my father? For there is no logical route from that time and place to this moment and this place. Sometimes, though, like now, I wonder if I'm delusional. Did I merely imagine the events that catapulted me out of one world and into another? Self-doubt, my one constant, had migrated with me between those two worlds. Just because I had attained this lofty position didn't mean the ghosts of the past had gone away. I look once again at the instrument panel and then back to the whiteness passing far below at a barely discernible 600 miles an hour. Inside, outside, what is the truth? Did I imagine all those long ago events?
Wow. Well, I definitely want to keep reading now. Oh my gosh. I mean, is this your only book, or do you have other projects in mind?
This is my second book. And so 4 years ago, I co-wrote a book with a woman who was just a genius with children. She was an educator. And so I had sort of watched her for years and really wanted to know what her secret was, and never kind of had the courage to ask her until she retired. And then I was like, I just couldn't get it out of my mind. I was like, somebody should write about what she did. And so I asked her, if she would agree to be interviewed, that I would try to write about her, um, what she did and how she did it. And so that's what I did. I sat down and I wrote it, and it was the book that I wished I'd had as a young parent. And actually, my kids were 15 and 17, I think, when I finished it, and it made me a better parent. I still think about the things in it today, understanding um, her philosophy.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but it sounds like something that I wish I had had when my children were young too.
We don't get any training,
Oh no.
you know?
Well, we get the training that our parents give us.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
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 And are you writing now?
I am writing now. So in the back of this book, I wrote that my next book is Adventures of the Soul. And so I write about this journey of kind of this path of mystery and magic of the way life unfolds, and how to do that at a conscious level, like how to collaborate with your intuition, like your inner voice, the inspirations, synchronicities, just how to kind of pay attention and then practically apply it. So that's one of the things that I'm working on. And then I have this other book that's actually working its way through me, and I think it might be first. So, we'll see.
I know that's how inspiration comes. They just won't leave you alone. These
Exactly.
brain children, they
Exactly.
sit in the corner banging on their high chairs, demanding attention. I have two of them right now that are doing that to me.
No, it's lovely, and sometimes it's like,
I know.
I
I
have other
know.
things I want to do.
I know. I mentioned to you the other day that in an interview that I just did with Lauren Kessler, who was the author of the Happy Bottom Writing Club, who is also a prolific writer, not an aviator at all. She's a writer and a professor of writing by trade, and
Oh,
she's written a
okay.
book, The Right Path. In our writing conversation, we got into a little deeper detail on a portion of her book where she talks about memoir and the fact that it's not nonfiction, it's not fiction. And then we talk a little bit about, I think we got to the point where, you know, memoir is memory, but not necessarily factual memory, it's emotional memory, like how you personally experienced events. Somebody could tell the same story of that same time or same event and see it from a completely different perspective. But you wrote a memoir in the context of someone who has a tremendous amount of public record around your memory. And so make this sort of unique situation. Tell me about how and whether you incorporated that public record in the writing of this book.
I did. It's actually a huge part of the book, and I did it for a very specific reason, and that is the story that was told at a public level. There was a great deal of gaslighting, enough so that there were stories that my father told that I didn't understand. I didn't understand them until I began to do the research. Um, and so, gaslighting, we're more familiar with that term today, but for people who don't know it, gaslighting is essentially, um, it is twisting the truth. It is, it's like up is down, down is up. And for my father, what we noticed as children is that he would begin to say something and he would kind of twist something, right? And then he said it so often that he began to believe it. And at the point where he believed it, the more he believed it, the more certainty he said it, and then the more charismatic he became. So, and this was just, like I said, this was a huge story, national news, Canadian television and newspapers. So I used one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to show how abusers operate. And I don't say that to dehumanize my father. It is about a particular behavior pattern that I'm talking about. But I wanted to show how this universal standard operating procedure, because it is a standard operating procedure around the world. I wanted to show what it looks like for people so they can see how this gets constructed, how people come to believe this. And so the public record was very important to lay out a timeline of what we were experiencing versus what he was saying. And it was hugely helpful. And because I have to remember, a lot of this went on while I was a child. And so, you believe what your parents say. And I was like, and my father was always very big about honesty. And so it was very confusing. It was like, well, this isn't what we're experiencing. And, there's this difference between the public record and the private record. And so I really wanted to write about that.
Do you think your father suffered from mental illness?
So, what I say, because he was very sensitive he has always been very sensitive to that charge that he is mentally ill. What I would say is that he suffers from multiple unhealed traumas that predated the shunning. And the other thing is that, I think that it's easy to classify, how do I say this? It's easy to put him in a compartment as an individual who is mentally, emotionally disturbed, but it takes it out of the culture that he grew up that promoted these ideas about women, as his wife and his children were essentially property. And that's what he was fighting about. And so it destroyed his life. It severely impacted ours. So he's a product of his environment, and part of that environment was trauma, in my opinion, for him.
Well, thank you, Patty. This has been so fun. I'm so grateful to know you. I'm so grateful for your story. I can't wait to read the book, and I can't wait to talk to you more in the writers group. It's awesome.
Oh, and likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. Patty's book is one of over 500 books featuring women in aviation that you'll be able to find on the Aviatrix Book Review website, which launches in March. Please be sure to check it out. Blue skies, everyone.
And here I am, I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say